September, 52 BC. A man stands upon the skeleton of a watchtower, the cold autumn wind whipping his crimson cloak. He is neither king nor emperor, but soon he will be everything. He is Gaius Julius Caesar, and his gaze is not fixed upon the fortress he besieges, the Gallic oppidum of Alesia, but beyond, towards a horizon boiling with a human tide. His 50,000 legionaries, the deadliest men in the known world, are an island of steel trapped between two oceans of fury. Before them, 80,000 Gallic warriors, led by the charismatic Vercingetorix, are dying of hunger and rage within their walls. At their back, a relief army of 250,000 men, an avalanche of united tribes, marches to wipe them from the face of the earth. Caesar is not surrounded. He has chosen this cage. He has turned miles of hostile land into a mortal arena of his own design, a double trap from which no one, neither besieged nor rescuers, could escape. The giant looming over Caesar had two heads. The first was the fortress city of Alesia, an eagle's nest on an impregnable hill, where 80,000 of Gaul's fiercest warriors, under the direct command of Vercingetorix, sharpened their swords and waited. They were the elite of the rebellion, men who had tasted Roman blood at Gergovia and believed they had cracked the code of the legion's invincibility. Their morale was high, their defensive position was perfect, and their leader was a living symbol of Gallic unity, a man capable of uniting enemy tribes under a single banner by the sheer force of his charisma and his vision of a free Gaul. They were the anvil, patiently awaiting the hammer's strike. The hammer was the giant's second head, a force so vast it defied the military imagination of the age. 250,000 men, a congregation of nearly every Gallic tribe, answered Vercingetorix's call. It was not an army, it was an armed migration, an entire nation on a war footing, advancing to crush the small Roman force. Its strength lay not in discipline or tactics, but in the brute weight of numbers and a shared hatred for the invader. Horsemen, infantry, nobles, and peasants, all united by one purpose: to annihilate Caesar and his legions, to free their brothers in Alesia, and to drive Rome from their lands forever. They were a force of nature, a tsunami of iron and fury. Vercingetorix's confidence was his greatest weapon and his fatal flaw. He was a brilliant leader, the first to understand that only a unified Gaul could resist Rome. His scorched earth strategy had previously checked Caesar, forcing him into a humiliating retreat at Gergovia. Now, secure in his fortress and aware of the colossal army coming to his aid, he allowed himself to be surrounded. He believed that hunger and attrition would do the dirty work, that the Romans would consume themselves trying to assault his walls, while the relief army prepared to deliver the final blow. He saw Alesia as the perfect bait in an infallible trap, not realizing that the true trapper was the man outside. The giant's arrogance was based on a logical but flawed assumption, that the war would be decided by the sword and by numbers. Vercingetorix fatally underestimated Caesar's true weapon, a weapon more powerful than the gladius and more resilient than the scutum, the legionary's shovel. He could not conceive of the scale, speed, and discipline of Roman engineering. In his mind, the Romans were soldiers, not builders of worlds. He believed he had Caesar caught in a tactical problem, when in reality Caesar was already solving an equation of engineering and logistics that would change the rules of engagement before the real battle had even begun. Vercingetorix, the charismatic nobleman of the Arverni, had achieved the impossible by unifying the Gallic tribes, but his vision was anchored in the warrior traditions of his people. He knew the terrain, the valor of his men, and the power of a cavalry charge. However, his knowledge of the enemy was dangerously incomplete. He saw the legions as a killing machine, but not as a creating machine. His plan, though bold, was fundamentally simple: hold a strong position and wait for an overwhelmingly superior force to annihilate the enemy. This blind faith in numerical superiority became the blind spot that Caesar, with his calculating genius, was preparing to exploit in the most spectacular and terrifying way possible. On the other side of the scales, a solitary figure embodied the audacity and desperation of Rome. Gaius Julius Caesar was not just a general. He was an architect of empires, a political genius whose career hung by a thread. The recent defeat at Gergovia was not merely a stain on his military record. It was an open wound in his reputation, one that his enemies in the Roman Senate would exploit without mercy. For him, Alesia was not just another battle in the conquest of Gaul, it was the turning point of his life. A victory here would mean eternal glory and unchallengeable power. A defeat would mean exile, humiliation, and the end of all his ambitions. The pressure on his shoulders was titanic, but Caesar thrived under such weight. His army was a reflection of his own character, efficient, resilient, and absolutely lethal. 50,000 men, distributed in approximately 10 legions, were the backbone of his force. These were not mere soldiers, they were professionals hardened by nearly a decade of uninterrupted warfare in Gaul. Every legionary was an engineer, a builder, and a killer, capable of marching 20 miles with 70 pounds of equipment, digging a trench, and then fighting to the death. Alongside them fought the auxiliary troops, and among them, a secret weapon, an elite Germanic cavalry, fierce warriors whose loyalty was not to Rome, but to gold, and to Caesar's reputation as a leader who always won. The motivation of these men went beyond simple conquest. They fought for the security of Rome's borders, to pacify a region that had been a threat for centuries, but on a more personal level, they fought for their general. Caesar had cultivated an almost fanatical loyalty in his troops. He knew his centurions by name, shared their hardships, and promised them not only victory, but also the rewards it would bring: land, wealth, and honor. For them, Caesar's cause was their cause. Their survival in this strange and hostile land depended entirely on their commander's brilliance, and they were willing to follow him to the very gates of hell if he so ordered. The situation was desperate, a fact not lost on any of the legionaries driving their shovels into the Gallic soil. They were outnumbered 6-1, isolated in enemy territory, and hundreds of miles from any possible reinforcement. Logic dictated retreat, to seek more favorable ground. But logic was not the language of Julius Caesar. He saw in desperation an opportunity. He understood that by staying, by accepting the greatest challenge of his career, he could force a decisive end to the war. He was betting not only his life and the lives of his men, but the future of Rome, on a single, audacious gamble. Thus, the challenger prepared to face the giant, not with brute force, but with a superior intellect and an iron will. While Vercingetorix trusted in the muscle of his vast horde, Caesar trusted in the brain of his operation and the unbreakable discipline of his legions. The cause was not just to subdue Gaul, but to prove to the world, and especially to his rivals in Rome, that where others saw a dead end, he saw the stage for his greatest triumph. The land around Alesia would become the canvas upon which he would paint his masterpiece of strategy and will. This is the anatomy of a military miracle, a story of how audacity and engineering can defy the mathematics of war. It is proof that a single man, with a clear vision and an unbreakable will, can change the course of history against all odds. If these stories of strategic genius and desperate courage inspire you, if you believe that the great battles of the past hold lessons that resonate to this day, then join our legion. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and like this video to help us unearth more forgotten legends. Your support is the fuel that allows us to march on to the next great story. Caesar's secret hope was not a new battle tactic or a hidden legion, but an idea so audacious it bordered on madness: to build a prison around a fortress, and then to build a fortress around that prison. It was a plan born of the most absolute necessity. Unable to assault the hill of Alesia, and knowing that a massive relief army was on its way, Caesar decided to fight two battles at once, on a battlefield he himself would create from scratch. His genius lay in transforming an overwhelming numerical disadvantage into a tactical advantage, using the terrain not as an obstacle, but as a canvas for his work of deadly engineering. The first phase of the plan was the circumvallation, a 10-mile-long ring of fortifications that completely encircled Alesia. This was no simple fence. It was a complex defensive system that included a wooden palisade, watchtowers spaced at regular intervals, and in front of them, two ditches nearly 15 feet wide each, one of which Caesar had flooded by diverting nearby rivers. The purpose of this line was clear and brutal: to lock in Vercingetorix and his 80,000 men, cut off all their supply lines, and wait for hunger to devour them. This wall faced inward, turning the Gallic fortress into a cage, but the true masterpiece was the second line, the contravallation. This wall faced outward, extending for 13 grueling miles to protect the Romans from the impending Gallic relief army. It was a replica of the first line, but even more formidable. Caesar knew the main attack would come from the outside, so he reinforced this line with a killing field of sadistic ingenuity. He cleared the ground in front of the wall and sowed it with a series of diabolical traps, designed to shatter any infantry or cavalry charge before they even reached the main defenses, creating a hell on earth for his enemies. Between the two walls, in a corridor that became known as Roman no man's land, Caesar's legions made their camp. They were effectively besieging themselves, trapped between the anvil of Alesia and the hammer of the relief army. But it was a trap of their own choosing and design. The traps they sowed on the exterior were a catalog of terror. There were camouflaged pits with sharpened stakes at the bottom, called lilia, lilies, for their resemblance to the flower. There were the sippi, pits filled with sharpened, intertwined logs. And scattered across the entire field were the stimuli, iron barbs designed to impale the feet of men and horses. This double wall was not just a defense, it was a psychological weapon. For the Gauls trapped in Alesia, each passing day they saw their prison become more impregnable as their provisions dwindled. For the approaching relief army, the sight of this monstrous construction of earth and timber stretching as far as the eye could see must have been profoundly demoralizing. Caesar was not just building walls, he was building despair in the hearts of his enemies. He was rewriting the rules of siege warfare, turning his besiegers into the besieged, and preparing to kill two armies with a single brilliant stroke of engineering. The completion of this monumental work in just a few weeks is a testament to the incredible discipline and work capacity of the Roman legions. Thousands of men working day and night, felling forests, moving earth, digging ditches, all while fending off raids from the Gallic cavalry. It was a Herculean effort, a feat of logistics and will that dwarfed anything the Gauls had ever seen. This was Rome's true secret weapon, the ability to reshape the world to its will through sweat, discipline, and the shovel. The trap was set. All Caesar had to do now was wait for his enemies to throw themselves upon it. In the tense days that followed the completion of the fortifications, an unnatural silence fell over the valley. It was the premonitory stillness that precedes a volcano's eruption. Inside Alesia, the initial arrogance of Vercingetorix and his warriors began to erode, replaced by a growing anxiety. They saw the Roman walls as the jaws of a beast that had closed around them. Though they still trusted in the arrival of their brethren, every ration of grain they consumed was a reminder that their time was running out. The fortress, once a symbol of power, had become a prison where hunger was the jailer. From the outside, on the horizon, Roman scouts reported the first signs of the approaching tide. The Gallic relief army, in its immense numbers, moved slowly, a multicolored serpent of clans and banners. Their confidence was absolute. They were an ocean about to crash against a thin dam of wood and earth. Their leaders debated the best way to attack, certain that victory was inevitable. They could not conceive that a force as small as Caesar's could withstand their combined assault. For them, the question was not if they would win, but how glorious the slaughter of the trapped Romans would be. Meanwhile, in the corridor between the two walls, the Roman legionaries waited. They had done their work. They had built their fortress and their cage. Now they braced for the storm they knew was coming. The atmosphere in the Roman camps was one of grim, quiet determination. There was no room for fear, only for discipline and preparation. They sharpened their gladi, repaired their shields, and listened to the orders of their centurions. Every man knew his post on the wall. Every man knew he would fight back to back with his comrades, facing attacks from the front and the rear. They trusted in their defenses, but above all, they trusted in Caesar. The first spark that ignited the conflagration was not a clash of swords, but an act of desperate foresight. Just before the ring of circumvallation was completely sealed, Vercingetorix made a crucial decision. He gathered all his cavalry and, under the cover of night, sent them through the remaining gap in the Roman lines. Their mission was sacred: to ride to every corner of Gaul, invoke the ancient pacts of unity, and summon the great relief army. It was a race against time. Every day the cavalry took to return with aid was another day Alesia sank deeper into famine, and another day Caesar's fortifications grew stronger. As the engineering trap was being completed, the Gauls inside Alesia did not remain idle. They launched a series of cavalry attacks against the Roman construction crews, attempting to sabotage their work and find a weak point. Here, Caesar unleashed his own specialized weapon, his Germanic cavalry. These horsemen, larger and fiercer than their Gallic counterparts, fought, not with the same finesse, but with a controlled brutality that terrified the enemy. In every skirmish, the Germans proved their superiority, driving back the Gauls and securing the perimeter so the legionaries could continue their work uninterrupted. These first clashes were more than mere skirmishes. They were a crucial test. They demonstrated the effectiveness of Caesar's auxiliary troops and validated his strategy of using specialized forces to counter the enemy's strengths. For the Gauls, it was a worrying omen. Their cavalry, traditionally one of their greatest advantages on the battlefield, was being systematically outmatched. Every fallen Gallic horseman was an irreplaceable loss within the besieged city, while Caesar's forces remained secure behind their growing defenses. The first test of strength had ended with a clear psychological advantage for the Romans. The departure of the Gallic cavalry marked the true beginning of the siege. For Vercingetorix, it was an all-or-nothing gamble. He had given up his most important mobile force in the hope of a much greater reward. Now, he and his 80,000 infantry warriors were completely trapped, watching as the last gap in the Roman wall closed, sealing their fate. The city, once a bastion of Gallic resistance, had become an hourglass. Every grain of food that fell brought them one step closer to surrender or death, while the echo of their horsemen's hooves faded into the distance, carrying with it their only hope of salvation. Weeks turned into a month, and the hope inside Alesia began to sour into desperation. The great Gallic relief army, despite its immense size, was organizing with excruciating slowness, a flaw inherent in tribal alliances. Meanwhile, inside the city, the specter of hunger became a tangible and cruel reality. The granaries were empty, the animals had been slaughtered, and the warriors, once proud and strong, now looked at their families with growing anguish. Vercingetorix's strategy depended on a swift rescue, and that rescue was not coming. Time, which he believed to be his ally, had become his executioner. Facing imminent catastrophe, Vercingetorix was forced to make one of the most brutal and heart-wrenching decisions of antiquity. In a council of war, it was decided that to conserve the meager provisions for the combatants, all non-combatants must be expelled from the city. Women, children, and the elderly, the families of the very men defending the walls, were led out of the gates of Alesia and pushed towards the Roman lines. Their hope was that Caesar, out of pity or because of the logistical burden they would represent, would accept them as prisoners, or at least let them pass. It was an act of absolute desperation, an attempt to lighten the load of the dying city. Caesar's response was as merciless as it was calculated. He refused to let them pass. He had built his defenses to keep the warriors in and the rescuers out. There was no room in his equation for thousands of innocent mouths. The Gallic non-combatants were trapped in no man's land, between the walls of their own home, which now denied them entry, and the impenetrable Roman fortifications. They begged their countrymen to let them back in, and the Romans to enslave them, but both sides refused. In one of the most tragic episodes of the Gallic Wars, these people slowly starved to death, in full view of both armies. This act of calculated cruelty served a dual purpose for Caesar. First, it preserved his own carefully rationed provisions, which were also stretched to the limit. Second, and more importantly, it was a devastating psychological blow to the defenders of Alesia. The warriors on the walls were forced to watch the agony of their own families, a daily spectacle of horror that sapped their morale and their will to fight. Caesar's decision, though monstrous from a humanitarian perspective, was militarily effective. It showed the Gauls that he was willing to go to any length to win, and that there would be no mercy or quarter in this final battle. Finally, like a long-awaited storm, the horizon darkened with banners, and the ground trembled beneath the feet of 250,000 men. The Gallic relief army had arrived. Their appearance unleashed a deafening roar from both outside and inside the Roman lines. For the besieged in Alesia, it was the sound of salvation. For the Romans, it was the sound of final judgment. The Gallic plan was simple and brutal, a massive coordinated assault from both directions. Vercingetorix would hurl his starving and desperate men against the inner wall, while the relief army would crash against the outer wall. The Romans would be crushed in the middle. The first assault was a wave of fury. Thousands of Gallic warriors charged across the fields, screaming their war cries, only to meet Caesar's engineered hell. Men and horses fell screaming into the pits of the Lilia, impaled on hidden stakes. They stumbled on the stimuli, which tore their feet apart and became entangled in the Sippi. Those who managed to get past the traps reached the main ditches and the palisade, where they were met with a rain of javelins, arrows, and stones hurled from the towers. The initial attack, based on momentum and brute force, broke against the carefully prepared Roman defense. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix launched his own attack from Alesia. His men, weakened but driven by the adrenaline of hope, swarmed out, trying to fill the inner ditches and scale the walls. Now, Caesar's nightmare became reality. His legions were forced to fight on two fronts at once. Centurions shouted orders, moving cohorts from one wall to the other to reinforce threatened points. Legionaries fought back to back, turning to face an enemy from within, then running to repel an assault from without. The corridor between the walls became a human press, a cauldron of steel, sweat, and blood. The battle raged for days, with relentless attacks and counterattacks. The Gauls, learning from their initial failure, concentrated their efforts on specific points, trying to breach the line by sheer pressure. During the night, they launched surprise attacks, using the darkness to cover their advance. But Roman discipline held firm. The legions, though stretched to the absolute limit, did not break. They fought with mechanical efficiency, rotating lines so that fresh men could replace the exhausted, repairing breaches. In the defenses under a hail of projectiles, and withstanding wave after wave of attacks, the situation was critical. The Romans were taking casualties, and the physical and mental exhaustion was extreme. Every legionary knew that any breach in either wall would mean total annihilation. They were fighting not just for victory, but for their very survival. The air was thick with smoke, the screams of the wounded, and the ceaseless sound of metal striking metal. The genius of Caesar's trap had become his own cage, and the key to survival was whether his thin line of defenders could withstand the combined weight of two armies determined to crush them. The Gallic commanders, frustrated by the resilience of the fortifications, sought a new strategy. They sent scouts to analyze every inch of the contravallation line, searching for a weak point, a place where the terrain had prevented the Romans from building their defenses with the same thoroughness. And finally, they found it. A section of the wall on hilly ground to the north, where the steep slopes had made it impossible to dig the complex system of ditches and traps. This would be the point of their final, most desperate attack, the gamble that would decide the fate of Gaul. The intensity of the conflict reached its peak. The Gauls launched diversionary attacks all along the outer line to pin down the Roman troops, while their elite assault force, composed of 60,000 of their best warriors, moved stealthily towards the identified weak point. At the same time, Vercingetorix, watching for the signals from Alesia, prepared his men for the final coordinated assault against the inner wall. All the pieces were in place for the masterstroke. The fate of 500,000 men hung on the thread of what would happen in the next crucial hours. The final assault began with apocalyptic ferocity. The 60,000 elite Gallic warriors descended upon the weak point in the Roman fortifications like an avalanche. In that section, the battle was not one of engineering, but of pure brute force. The Gauls, using grappling hooks and ladders, swarmed over the palisades, engaging the legionaries in desperate hand-to-hand combat. At the same time, Vercingetorix launched his own all-out attack, forcing the Roman defenders to divide themselves even further. For the first time, the Gauls managed to break through. The Roman line began to buckle under the unbearable pressure. Collapse seemed imminent. In this moment of supreme crisis, Caesar's true genius as a field commander shone through. Observing the battle from a watchtower, he identified the exact point where the battle would be won or lost. Leaving his lieutenant, Titus Labienus, in charge of the main defense, Caesar personally gathered a handful of reserve cohorts, the last fresh troops he had left. He did not send them directly to plug the breach, which would have only fed the meat grinder. Instead, he made a bold decision that would change the course of history. Leading his men on horseback, his distinctive crimson cloak flying so that all, friend and foe, could see him, Caesar did not head towards the breach, but rode out of the fortifications. He executed a wide, flanking maneuver, galloping along the outside of his own battle line, concealed by the terrain. His objective was not to reinforce his men from the front, but to attack the Gallic assault force from the rear. It was an incredibly risky gamble. If he was spotted too soon, he and his small reserve force would be annihilated in the open field. The moment of his appearance was a masterpiece of tactical timing. Just as the Gauls who had broken the line believed victory was within their grasp, the sound of Roman horns echoed behind them. Caesar and his reserve cohorts crashed into their unprotected rear. The impact was devastating, not just physically but psychologically. The Gallic warriors, focused on the frontal combat, turned to see a new Roman army, led by Caesar himself, attacking them from behind. Panic is a plague, and it spread through their ranks like wildfire. The sight of Caesar's red cloak in their rear broke the spirit of the Gallic attack. Those at the vanguard, trapped between the Roman defenders to their front and the new threat at their backs, were the first to falter. Their cohesion disintegrated, and the elite assault force turned into a terrified mob. The Roman legionaries, revitalized by the appearance of their general, launched a furious counterattack from the wall, exploiting the chaos. The turning point had come. Caesar's brilliant maneuver had not only saved the day, but had turned a desperate defense into a decisive offense. The panic that seized the Gallic assault force in the rear spread like a shockwave across the entire battlefield. The rest of the relief army, seeing their elite contingent crumble and flee, lost all cohesion. Discipline, always fragile in a tribal army, evaporated in an instant. The coordinated attack became a chaotic retreat, and the retreat soon became a desperate rout. Chieftains lost control of their men, and the vast army of 250,000 warriors dissolved into a mass of terrified individuals, seeking only to save their own lives. It was then that Caesar unleashed his predators. The Germanic cavalry, which he had held in reserve for precisely this moment, were ordered to pursue. They poured out of the gates of the fortifications like wolves let loose on a flock of sheep. Their pursuit was relentless and brutal. They fell upon the fleeing Gallic warriors who had thrown away their shields and weapons to run faster. There was no mercy. The cavalry slaughtered thousands, turning what should have been a retreat into a systematic annihilation that lasted until nightfall. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix and his men watched in horror as their only hope was exterminated before their eyes. They saw the disintegration of their relief army, the rout, the pursuit, and the slaughter. The roar of battle was replaced by the screams of the dying. The morale inside the fortress, which had soared to euphoric heights hours earlier, plummeted into an abyss of absolute despair. They understood that all was lost. There would be no rescue. There would be no victory. All that remained was surrender or death by starvation. The collapse was total and absolute. The backbone of Gallic military power had not just been bent, it had been shattered. In the course of a single day, the largest congregation of Gallic warriors ever assembled had been defeated and scattered, not by a superior force, but by the discipline, engineering, and tactical genius of an army vastly outnumbered. The battlefield around the outer wall became a vast graveyard, a testament to the deadly efficiency of the Roman war machine when led by a master. The Battle of Alesia was over. At dawn the next day, the frantic pace of battle gave way to a sepulchral silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded. The battlefield was a vision of hell. The ground was covered by a carpet of bodies, broken weapons, and fallen banners. The scale of the carnage was unimaginable. Roman historians, though prone to exaggeration, paint a picture of near-total annihilation. They claim that Gallic losses between those killed in combat and those massacred in the rout amounted to the astonishing figure of 250,000 men. Another 40,000 were taken prisoner, destined to be sold as slaves. In stark contrast, Roman casualties were miraculously light. Estimates speak of some 12,800 men, a painful figure but insignificant compared to the losses inflicted on the enemy. The ratio was chilling and underscored the magnitude of Caesar's victory. He had faced a combined force of over 330,000 warriors, with barely 50,000 of his own, and had not only survived but had annihilated them. The fortifications, the killing field they had created, had worked to perfection, neutralizing the enemy's numerical advantage and allowing the legionaries to inflict maximum damage at minimum risk. With his relief army destroyed and his people starving, Vercingetorix had no choice but unconditional surrender. The next day, the gates of Alesia opened. According to the legend described by Plutarch, the Gallic leader donned his finest armor, mounted his best war horse, and rode alone to the Roman camp. He circled the platform where Caesar was seated and then, in an act of theatrical submission, dismounted, threw his weapons at Caesar's feet, and sat down in silence, awaiting his fate. The great unifier of Gaul, the man who had nearly brought Rome to its knees, was now a prisoner. Vercingetorix's fate was a cruel end to a heroic life. He was not granted a swift death on the battlefield. Instead, he was put in chains and taken to Rome as the chief prize of Caesar's conquest. For 6 long years, he languished in a Roman prison while Caesar fought his civil war and consolidated his power. Finally, in 46 BC, he was brought out of his cell to be paraded in Caesar's great triumphal procession, a public spectacle of Gaul's subjugation. Immediately after the triumph, he was taken to the Tullianum, the state prison, and executed, most likely by strangulation. The surrender marked the end of organized resistance in Gaul. The 40,000 prisoners captured were distributed among Caesar's legionaries, one for each soldier, as personal spoils of war, a reward that further secured their unwavering loyalty. The treasure of Alesia and the riches of the captured Gallic nobles filled Caesar's coffers, providing him with the funds he would need for his future political ambitions. The battlefield was cleared, the dead were buried or left for the crows, and silence returned to the valley, a silence that spoke of the end of an era for the Gallic people. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it sent a shockwave throughout Gaul. The tribes that were still resisting laid down their arms, recognizing the futility of continuing to fight against such a formidable power. Caesar's masterpiece of engineering and tactics at Alesia had not just won a battle, it had won a war that had lasted nearly a decade. The bloody embers left an indelible scar on the land and in the memory of the Gallic people, a scar that would mark the beginning of their long and profound transformation into a Roman province. The contrast between the two commanders at the moment of surrender is the final, most powerful image of the battle. Caesar, the calculating genius, seated in his campaign chair, accepting his enemy's submission with impassive calm, his mind already on the future political battles awaiting him in Rome. And Vercingetorix, the passionate defender of Gallic freedom, stripped of his pride and his cause, surrendering to his conqueror. It was the final clash between two worlds, and on the blood-soaked field of Alesia, the world of Rome proved to be the stronger. The fall of Alesia was much more than the end of a battle. It was the death blow that crushed the last great unified resistance in Gaul. Caesar's victory was so decisive that it ended nearly a decade of brutal warfare and paved the way for the complete Romanization of the region. For the next 500 years, Gaul would become one of the richest and most vital provinces of the Roman Empire, adopting the Latin language, Roman laws, and Roman culture. The blood shed at Alesia served as the foundation upon which a new society would be built, permanently binding the fate of Gaul to that of Rome. For Julius Caesar, Alesia was the pinnacle of his military career, the crown jewel of his conquests. The victory brought him immense wealth, a veteran and fanatically loyal army, and a reputation for unparalleled military genius. This power and prestige made him the most influential man in Rome, but also the most feared by his rivals in the Senate. The confidence and resources gained in Gaul were precisely what enabled him to challenge the Senate, cross the Rubicon, and unleash the civil war that would ultimately lead to him becoming dictator of Rome, forever altering the trajectory of the Republic. Militarily, the siege of Alesia became a legendary case study, analyzed by generals and strategists for centuries. The audacious construction of double fortifications and the successful conduct of a two-front battle against an overwhelmingly superior enemy became the epitome of tactical daring and engineering excellence. Caesar himself immortalized his achievement in his Commentaries on the Gallic War, a masterpiece of propaganda and historical narrative that ensured his version of events was the one that endured through history, cementing his own legend for posterity. Ironically, the figure of his defeated adversary, Vercingetorix, would experience a remarkable resurgence almost 2 millennia later. In the 19th century, Amidst nationalist fervor, France rediscovered the ancient Arvernian chieftain and transformed him into a founding myth. Vercingetorix was reinvented as the first national hero of France, a symbol of patriotic resistance against a foreign invader. Monumental statues were erected in his honor, including one on the presumed site of Alesia, turning the leader of a failed rebellion into an immortal icon of the French spirit of independence and defiance. Thus, the Battle of Alesia left a dual legacy that resonates to this day. For Rome, it was the victory that completed its Western Empire and catapulted its most brilliant general to absolute power. For modern France, it became an origin story, a tale of heroic sacrifice in the face of inevitable conquest. The echo of swords clashing in that Burgundian valley has resounded through history, reminding us how a single day can forge the destiny of nations, create legends, and shape the identity of an entire continent for millennia. The story of Alesia, as told by Caesar, is so grand that for centuries some historians doubted its veracity, considering it a propagandistic exaggeration. They questioned whether it was possible for such a massive engineering work to have been built so quickly. But the Earth does not forget. In the 1860s, archaeological excavations ordered by Emperor Napoleon III at the site identified as Alise-Sainte-Reine in France began to unearth the truth. And what they found was astonishing. The unmistakable remains of Caesar's double fortification lines, the ditches, the traps, everything exactly as he had described it. The legend was real. The archaeological findings not only confirmed the scale of the siege, but also revealed the intimate and brutal details of the combat. Thousands of artifacts were unearthed: arrowheads, javelins, Roman coins, and the bones of men and horses. Each object was a silent echo of the violence that took place there. Archaeology gave a voice to the silent. Legions and the Gallic hordes, validating the account of the general who defeated them, and proving that his engineering masterpiece was not a myth, but a tangible and deadly reality etched into the French landscape. But among all the discoveries, one of them connects the present to the past in a profoundly personal and chilling way. Archaeologists found a small sling bullet, a lead projectile designed to be launched with lethal velocity. It was not just any bullet. On its surface, hand-engraved, by a legionary more than 2,000 years ago, was an inscription. It was not a curse or a symbol. It was a name: Labian. Titus Labienus, Caesar's most important and effective lieutenant. It was a deadly signature, a calling card left amidst the carnage, a reminder that behind the grand strategies and anonymous armies, history is always made by individuals.